The tower was not a place meant for living. It was a place meant for forgetting. Isolde Crimsonvale had measured its dimensions 1,000 times over, 15 paces across at the widest point, 12 at the narrowest. The walls were stone, damp with age and the seep of mountain rains, and embedded throughout that gray surface were bars of iron that had never rusted because the iron itself seemed to drink in rust, to swallow it, to suppress everything living and shifting and wild. Her fingers traced the grout between stones every morning, feeling for changes that never came. The iron was constant. The iron was the only reliable thing in the world. The slot in the door where food arrived was also constant. 3 times daily, a wooden bowl would slide through, thin gruel in the morning, harder bread with weak cheese at midday, and more gruel in the evening. The quality had declined over the years, she'd noticed. She noticed everything now. When she was 16 and first brought here, the bread had been nearly edible. Now it was hard enough to break a tooth on, and she'd learned to soak it in the water they gave her, water that came in a clay pitcher, also through the slot. No hands ever came with the food. No eyes ever looked at her. Once, in the first months, she'd tried to grab the bowl holder's wrist, hoping to force conversation, connection, proof that someone on the other side of that door remembered she was human. The bowl had been yanked away so hard the wood left splinters in her palms. The next day, a note had been slid through, written in crude letters. Try again, lose the food for a week. She had not tried again. The scratch marks on the wall counted 2,555 days. That was 7 years and exactly 1 day since she'd been taken up the spiral stairs, shoved through the heavy oak door banded with iron, and locked inside with a bucket for waste and a prayer that didn't work. She counted in groups of 5, each mark giving way to a diagonal slash through the group, then starting again. The marks climbed from the corner near the small, barred window, the only window placed high enough that she had to jump to see out of it, and when she did, all she could see was sky and the dark line of distant mountains. Never the ground. Never enough to know where she was in relation to the world. The marks climbed halfway up the wall now, a chronicle of time that meant nothing because time itself had stopped having meaning. What day was it? The 22nd of spring heel. What did that matter? What day of the week? She'd stopped caring years ago. Moon phase? She tracked it by the light coming through the window, and it was waning now, the silver light that came through the bars creating a grid pattern across the stone floor that she'd memorized completely. She knew the order of the bars from left to right, knew which ones were thinner than the others, knew where the light fell first when the moon was full and where the darkness pooled last when it was new. She knew the weight of the chains attached to her left ankle. The chain was short, 6 feet, and it ran through a bolted ring set deep into the stone. They'd installed it after another Omega had tried to run during a transfer out of the tower. Isolde had been 12 then, not yet presented, Yi watching from her corner as they'd chained Marta like a dog, then unchained her and led her out into the corridor and locked the door behind them. She never came back. None of them came back after they left, but Isolde had been left behind, always left behind. The chain had been heavy at first, biting into her ankle, raising blisters that went infected before she figured out how to keep the wound clean with the rationed water. Now the skin there was thick and calloused, and she barely felt the weight anymore. The chain defined her world, 6 feet in any direction from the iron ring. She'd optimized every inch. The bucket was positioned at the edge of her range. The water pitcher sat within arm's reach when she sat in her corner. Her sleeping area was in the furthest point from the door, being dark enough that she could almost believe she was somewhere else when her eyes were closed. The walls had changed under her hands. When she first arrived, she'd had energy born of fury and denial. She'd pressed her palms against the stone between the iron bars, and the iron had burned her. Not hot, but cold, so intensely cold that it burned like fire. The Omega in her, the part that had only just awakened when she was 16, had shrieked against that suppression. Her wolf had clawed at the inside of her skin, desperate to shift, to fight, to flee. The iron had held firm. The wolf had backed away, whimpering, and slowly over months had learned that there was no escaping. The tower was stronger than instinct. So Isolde had learned to live in her human form, in her rational mind, in the parts of herself that could adapt. She'd started moving her body methodically, not frantic, but purposeful. 20 push-ups each morning, 50 sit-ups, lunges across her cell. She did them in the dark because the light from outside showed her how small she was, how the months were eating her, and she couldn't bear it. In the dark, she was just movement and breath, and that was something. She sang to herself. She didn't have a good voice. Her throat was always dry, always rough from the damp air and the poor food. But she sang anyway. Old ballads her mother had taught her before the cancer had taken her, before Isolde was even presented. Songs about love and battles and men riding through snowy forests looking for their fated mates. Those songs meant something different now. Those songs were cruel jokes the universe had decided to play on her. But she sang them anyway, perhaps because the sound of her own voice, however imperfect, was proof that she still existed, that she was still a creature capable of beauty, even in a place designed to erase all beauty. She talked to herself, too. She narrated her existence out loud, giving names to the marks on the walls, inventing histories for the imaginary people who lived in the stones. She told herself stories about the women whose names were scratched into these walls, the ones who had come before her, the ones who had been taken, the ones who had left traces of themselves behind. She imagined their lives beyond the tower, hoping they had found freedom, hoping they had found mates who treated them as more than property. She told herself stories about escaping, detailed fantasies where she picked the locks, she didn't have picks, where she broke the iron, she'd tested it with rocks and the rocks shattered, where she simply walked through the door and no one was on the other side to stop her. She told these stories not because she believed them, but because the telling of them was a form of resistance, a refusal to accept the silence as permanent. The fantasies had become less vivid over time. They'd been replaced by something else, something she didn't have a name for. Not quite resignation, because she still woke every morning and scratched her mark, still did her exercises, still sang her songs. But something quieter, something that accepted the possibility that this was her life now, that she would die in this tower, her bones would be found years later, and the world would never know that Isolde Crimsonvale had existed at all. Well, the other Omegas had at least known she existed. She remembered them all, each one a bright spark of connection in the gray monotony. Marta had been kind, had shared extra bread once when the guard wasn't looking, and the kindness had cost her something, had bought her a beating the next day that Isolde could hear through the walls, the sound of her screaming until she had no voice left. Elena had sung with her, their voices carrying through the corridor in two-part harmony until a guard had banged on the wall and screamed for them to shut up. Senna had been just 16 like Isolde had been, and she'd cried every night for the first 3 months, and Isolde had never once told her to stop, never once said, maybe it would get better, because that would have been a lie. Because instead she had sung the lullabies louder to cover the sound of Senna's tears. Claire had been older, nearly 25, and had spoken of her life before the tower, a mate she'd been promised to, a sister she'd left behind, a life that had been ripped away when she presented as Omega. The longing in her voice had been unbearable. Kes had only been 14 when she came to the tower, so young that she barely understood what was happening. She had kept asking when her parents were coming to get her. After 3 weeks, she'd stopped asking. They were all gone, taken from the tower one by one, sold off, or given as gifts to allied alphas, or bonded off to men who barely looked at them. She could map the progression. 2 Omegas taken the first year, 3 the next, then 2, then 1 each year after that. As Isolde had been left behind every single time, she'd asked the guards why, they'd never answered. The only explanation she had was that she was less valuable somehow, her violet eyes too strange, her silver hair more liability than asset, her Omega scent not strong enough to be useful. The thought had been her constant companion for 7 years, the terrible knowledge that she was worth nothing even in a place where Omegas were sold like livestock. Or maybe she'd just been forgotten. Maybe they'd written her name on a list somewhere and then lost the list. Maybe the pack had moved on and no one up the chain remembered there was still an Omega in the tower. She would have almost believed that, except that the food still came. Someone still fed her. Someone remembered her existence enough to keep her alive, even if barely. Today was different. Today was her 23rd birthday, and Isolde had not told anyone because no one had asked. She'd scratched her 5 mark to make 2,555, and she'd thought about the fact that she was 23 years old and had lived 7 of those years in a space smaller than most privies. She'd thought about the fact that she was presented, unmated, and would likely die unmated. The Omega in her had laughed at that. A hollow, bitter sound that came out of her throat, raw and sharp. She'd tried to do her exercises, but her body felt strange, unstable. There was a pressure inside her, something coiled and hot in her chest, something that had been building for weeks but had sharpened that day into something almost unbearable. She'd attributed it to hunger. The gruel had been thinner than usual, and her body, always undernourished, soon was beginning to eat itself. She had ribs that showed clearly through her skin, and her arms were thin as branches. Only her core had strength, developed from years of sit-ups and push-ups and crunches, an island of muscle surrounded by the famine of everything else. but it wasn't hunger. She knew what hunger felt like. This was something else. This was her wolf pushing at the iron, pushing at the suppression, pushing at the bars of her own cage. Her wolf was saying something in a language that was older than words. And for 7 years, Isolde had told her wolf to be quiet, to sleep, to accept. Tonight, as the waning moon climbed over the mountains and the bars on her window created their familiar grid of shadow and silver, Isolde felt the pressure become unbearable. She was pacing. Well, something she rarely did anymore because it exhausted her, because it wasted energy that she needed to ration. 6 feet forward, 6 feet back. The chain made a sound against the stone with each step, a metallic whisper that had become as normal as breathing. The window was above her, and she could see the moon, nearly half dark now, and the stars around it so distant and cold and utterly indifferent to her suffering. The pressure built. It built in her chest, in her throat, in her bones. It felt like something was trying to break out of her skin. The Omega in her was howling, and Isolde was trying to hold it back, trying to contain it like she'd contained everything else for 7 years, trying to be small and silent and acceptable. But tonight, on her 23rd birthday, something broke. She didn't decide to shift. The shift decided itself. It happened not despite the iron, but through it, her bones breaking and reforming in a way that should not have been possible, that the iron should not have allowed, but the iron was not strong enough for her anymore because she was not the girl who had entered this tower at 16. She was something else now, something forged in stone and silence and the slow accumulation of days. Her body was no longer hers to contain. The shift was agony, worse than it had ever been in practice, worse than anything she could have imagined. It was like being torn apart at every joint, like her entire self was being unmade and remade in a form that was too large for this small space. She screamed, and the scream became something else as the change took hold, something that came from a throat no longer quite human, a sound that was more than human, more than wolf, something that belonged to the wild places and the empty sky. The howl that came out of her was not learned. It was not controlled. It was pure fury and pure anguish and pure existence. 7 years of silence compressed into a single moment of absolute, undeniable sound. It carried everything. The names of the Omegas who had been taken, the count of days she had marked on the wall, the weight of the chain, the cold of the iron, the hunger, the loneliness, the unbearable, suffocating ache of 7 years in a tower meant for forgetting. The tower itself seemed to shake with it. The sound bounced off the stone walls and climbed through the narrow window and reached out across the mountains, a silver thread of sound in the night, traveling across miles of wild country, carrying on the wind as if the mountains themselves had decided to voice a truth that could no longer be contained. In the tower, a white wolf with violet eyes stood on shaking legs, breathing hard, her fur illuminated by the strange moonlight coming through the window, her eyes bright with tears and triumph and something desperate and alive. Isolde had broken through the iron suppression. Isolde had found her wolf, and the howl that had carried her to this moment was traveling across the darkness, calling out to whoever or whatever might listen, a prayer and a weapon and a declaration all at once. Miles away, far beyond the border of Hollowfang territory, Alpha King Theron Stormbreak felt it in his bones. He was in the saddle, patrolling the eastern edge of his territory with a small contingent of his elite guard, either the night patrol that was routine, that he insisted on doing himself because he did not ask his fighters to do what he would not do. The wind was cold and carried the scent of the coming spring underneath the winter chill, that particular smell of new growth beneath dormant things. His black horse was steady beneath him, a war-trained animal that flinched at nothing. But Theron heard it. The howl came from the south, from across the border, from deep in Hollowfang territory, and it hit him not like sound but like impact, like a physical blow that reverberated through his entire body. His horse reared. His hand flew to the hilt of his sword. His guard came alert around him, hands on weapons, suddenly scanning the darkness for threat. "Did you hear that?" one of them called. A fighter named Kess who'd served under him for 5 years. "I heard," Theron said, but he was not looking at them. He was looking south, into the darkness, and he could feel something happening in his chest that had never happened before. The burning in his eyes was intensifying. The amber ring that marked him as Apex Wolf suddenly flared, and for just a moment his vision shifted into the sharper, more immediate perception of his wolf form. He could see heat signatures in the darkness, could smell the territory markers of the Hollowfang pack drifting on the wind, could sense the borders of his own land ending where their land began. And he could feel something else. He could feel a pulling in his chest, in the very core of his being. A sensation like a hook had been set in his ribs, and something on the other end of that hook was reeling him in. The sensation was not painful, but it was overwhelming. It was consuming. It was the most present thing he had ever felt in his entire 31 years. "My lord?" Another guard, Soren, his captain of the guard, was at his stirrup now, concerned. "Are you well?" Theron looked at him, looked at his fighters, looked back toward the south. The howl had faded, but its echo remained in him, vibrating in his marrow. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to move, to ride, to find the source of that sound. "We ride," he said quietly. "South. Now. My lord, that's Hollowfang territory." "I know whose territory it is," Theron said. His voice was calm, but his hand was already gripping his horse's mane, and the warmth building in his core was traveling down his arms and legs. The wolf in him was not patient tonight. The wolf in him was responding to something ancient, and something that bypassed all reason. "Saddle up! Bring everything! We move!" They moved. His fighters knew better than to argue when their king used that tone. They wheeled their horses, urging them faster, and Theron pushed his mount to a gallop, and something that was not quite his human reason but was also not quite his wolf was guiding him, pulling him like that invisible hook toward something in the distance, toward that howl and whatever had produced it. The border markers of Hollowfang territory appeared through the darkness like accusations. They were marked by old bones nailed to trees, by scarred earth, by the stink of blood magic that Dragon Hollowfang used to declare his borders, not with the clean scent marking of a well-managed pack, but with violence. Theron's wolf bristled at the boundary, but he did not slow. No, his wolf did not care about borders. His wolf cared about one thing only, the source of that howl, which was pulling at him with increasing urgency. They found the tower as the moon was setting, when the darkness was deepest and the stars were fading. It rose from the barren ground like a corruption, a gray stone thing with iron running through it in a pattern that made Theron's eyes hurt to look at it. The iron was old and worked with dark magic, meant to suppress, meant to contain, meant to break. The stink of suffering came off it like smoke. Theron shifted before his horse had even come to a full stop, moving from saddle to human form to the ground in one fluid motion, his war coat settling around his shoulders, his hand moving to the axe at his back. "My lord!" Soren was beside him on foot, also shifted, to his own massive form moving with the careful control of a trained fighter. "This is their territory. If we breach that tower—" "There is something in there," Theron said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, deeper than usual, resonating from somewhere beyond his control. The amber ring around his pupil was burning, and his eyes were probably glowing gold. Someone. He could feel them. The hook in his chest was connected to something in the tower, something that was calling to every apex instinct he had. And underneath that, underneath the all-consuming urgency, was something else, a recognition. The magic that the mate bond created, the oldest magic that existed, the magic that transcended pack allegiance and territorial borders and all the careful rules that govern the world. "The mate bond," Soren whispered. "You're understanding what his king's eyes and scent were broadcasting. You found—" "The door," Theron said. He was already moving toward the tower, toward the iron-banded oak door that sealed it from the outside. The door had a lock the size of a man's fist, heavy iron worked into a wolf head shape. It looked ancient and impregnable. Theron reached for it. His hands had never been weak, and his position as apex of all the northern territories meant that he was stronger than most. Fed on better game, trained since childhood in the arts of combat and dominance. But he felt a surge of power run through him now that was more than that. It was the pure, undeniable force of the mate bond, feeding his body with the need to reach what was his, to claim what was calling to him, and to break any barrier that stood between him and the connection he could feel thrumming through his entire being. The lock shattered under his hands. The bolts that held the door gave way like they were made of paper. The door itself, heavy oak and iron and all, tore free from its hinges with a sound like the world breaking. Inside was darkness and the reek of 7 years of imprisonment. Inside was stone and iron and waste and despair. Inside was everything that made his wolf roar with rage at what had been done here. And in the corner, farthest from the door, lit by the pale light of the setting moon, was a white wolf with violet eyes. She was crouched, ready to fight or flee, her entire body quivering with adrenaline and power. Her fur was the color of moonlight on snow, and her eyes were the color of twilight. In those deep violet eyes that were watching him with absolute awareness. She was thin. He could see the definition of her ribs beneath her coat. but there was power in her frame, corded muscle earned through years of movement and will. She was not cowering. She was not submissive. She was ready. Theron felt every instinct he had scream at him to shift, to approach, to take her neck in his teeth and mark her, to bond himself to her in the primal way that was written into the very essence of what he was. He forced himself to remain still, forced his breathing to slow, forced his wolf to stand down from the precipice of instinct. "I am not your enemy," he said. His voice was low and steady, every ounce of his control focused on keeping his words human, his intent clear, his danger minimized. "My name is Theron Stormbreak. Well, I am Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The white wolf did not move. Her eyes tracked him, wary, intelligent. "The howl I heard," he continued, "was it you? Did you call out?" The wolf's ears twitched. She made a small sound that was not quite a growl, but not quite a whine. "You're safe," he said. "I'm taking you away from here. I'm taking you somewhere they can never put you back in a tower like this. You have my word." He reached out slowly, not to grab her, but to offer his hand. Open-palmed, the gesture of someone offering choice rather than demanding submission. The white wolf watched him for a long moment. Then, deliberately, she shifted. Her bones popped and reformed, her body compressed and expanded, and where a wolf had been, a woman appeared, thin and pale and scarred, and with long silver-white hair falling down her back, and those impossible violet eyes now set in a delicate, angular face. She was young, 23 maybe younger. She was clothed in rags, a threadbare gray linen shift that was more tears than fabric, and her left ankle bore the mark of a chain, the skin there thick and calloused and scarred. There was a small braided leather bracelet on her right wrist, the only thing she wore that wasn't broken, and it was clutched in her hand like it was the only thing she had left in the world. She looked at him, and her violet eyes were so sharp, so aware, so absolutely present, that Theron felt the mate bond twist in his chest again. "You're the Alpha King," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, raspy, but it held a clarity that made him think she had been talking to herself for years to keep her mind sharp. "You came because of my howl." "I did," he said. He was still offering his hand, still keeping his distance. "What is your name?" "Isolde," she said. "Isolde Crimsonvale." "Isolde," he repeated. The name felt important in his mouth, precious. "I am going to take you away from this place. You can come with me, or you can run. You can do whatever you want, but I will not leave you here." She looked at his hand, at his face, at the door behind him that he had torn apart. She looked back at the iron-filled stone of the tower, at the corner where she had been chained, at the life she had lived here for 7 years. Then she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were ice-cold and calloused and strong. The moment her skin touched his, the mate bond flared between them, gold light and warmth and a sense of wholeness that Theron had never experienced before. But he kept his grip gentle, kept his movements slow. This woman had been imprisoned. This woman had earned the right to choose, and Theron would make sure that whatever came between them came only from her choosing it. "My fighters are outside," he said. "We will travel to my fortress. There you can sleep, eat, rest. You are under my protection now," Isolde nodded, but she did not let go of his hand. She held it like it was the only solid thing in a world made of water, held it like she was afraid it would disappear if she relaxed her grip even a moment. "Will they come for me?" she asked. "The Hollow Fang pack? Will they come to take me back?" Theron looked at her. Then he looked back at the broken door, at the ruined tower, at this place of suffering that had been allowed to exist for 7 years under the watch of an alpha who was supposed to uphold the code that protected omegas instead of imprisoning them. "Let them try," he said quietly. And outside, his fighters waited, watching the tower with hard eyes, ready for anything. Subscribers to Wolfborn Tales, if you've ever felt trapped by circumstances or people who didn't recognize your worth, this story is for you. Isolde's journey is about reclaiming your voice, about survival becoming transformation, and about finding an alpha who respects your strength instead of trying to control it. The wolves that choose their mates freely are the ones who build empires together. Subscribe for more stories where Omega finds power and Alpha learns restraint. The ride to the fortress took the rest of the night and the whole of the next day. Isolde rode in front of Theron on his horse, wrapped in his black leather war coat because the mountain air was cold and she had no other clothing. She had spent most of the ride in a state of shock that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Not speaking, barely moving, just existing in a kind of trance as the world moved past her. After 7 years in a space 15 paces across, the journey was sensory overload. The wind on her face was unlike anything she'd experienced. Not the trapped, recycled air of the tower, but real wind. Moving air, wind that came from the mountains and carried the smell of snow and stone and living things. Her arms were around Theron's waist for balance, and even through the shock, she could feel the warmth of him. Not the solidity of him, the reality of him that felt like proof that she was not dreaming. The sky was vast. When they cleared the foothills and started across the open plains, the sky seemed to go on forever, and Isolde felt her mind stretch painfully, trying to contain the amount of space and light and possibility that the sky contained. In the tower, she had seen sky only through the narrow window, a rectangle of blue or gray or star-filled darkness. This was different. This was the whole thing, all of it, overwhelming and endless. The grass beneath the horses' hooves was spring growth, not yet full, but beginning, soft and tender and green. She could smell it even from the horse's back, the green smell of growing things, something she had not smelled in 7 years, something that made her eyes water for reasons she didn't fully understand. They stopped once, at a stream, and Theron helped her down. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs gave way. She had not walked properly in 7 years. The chain had kept her to 6 feet in any direction, and the space had been cramped enough that real walking was impossible. Her legs remembered the motion in theory, but not in practice. Theron caught her before she fell, his hands steady under her elbows, and he did not make her feel weak for it. He simply held her up, steady, while her body remembered what it meant to be in a real space, with real distance. They drank from the stream, and the water was cold and clean and tasted like something more than the stale water that came through the slot in the tower. Isolde's stomach hurt from drinking it. She nodded, probably because her body was not used to anything pure. She drank anyway. She could not help herself. Theron offered her dried meat and bread from their supplies. Real bread, dense and whole, not the crumbling remnant of near-stale grain that had been her diet. She ate slowly because her stomach was small and angry, but she ate, and the food was real enough to be almost painful. Almost too much. Almost more than her body could process. "We will reach the fortress by evening," Theron said. He was sitting nearby, giving her space, letting her set the pace of interaction. "You will have a room, a soft bed, as much food as you want, water for washing. Rest." Isolde nodded, but did not speak. Words felt very heavy, the world felt very loud. The fortress appeared in late afternoon as the sun was beginning to descend toward the western peaks. When it rose from the landscape like a claim, a stronghold of gray stone and dark wood, built not to be overcome but to endure. It was larger than Isolde could quite process, larger than the entire area her mind had come to expect as the sum of all possible space. It had a courtyard with gardens that were just beginning to show the first growth of spring. It had multiple towers, not towers like the one she'd come from. These were different, they were part of something rather than cages. It had more people than she had seen at one time in the entirety of her life. The fighters came out to greet their king. There was a woman who seemed to be in charge of the household, a tall figure with graying hair who looked at Isolde with sharp eyes but did not speak or comment. The cook appeared, asking if the king needed food. When a healer, a woman with knowledge of medicines and wounds, approached with concern in her face. "She needs care," the healer said to Theron, looking at Isolde's thin frame, her scarred ankle, her calloused hands. "She's been starved and she's been chained. I'll need to examine her to see what damage has been done." "With her permission," Theron said. He looked at Isolde. "This is Marta. She is the fortress healer. She can help with your wounds if you want her to." Isolde looked at Marta. Then she looked at Theron. Then she nodded. She had learned long ago that her own comfort was not important, that her own preferences in terms of physical autonomy did not matter, that if someone in authority wanted to examine her, resistance was pointless. But something in Theron's phrasing, "with her permission," made her think that maybe in this place, hard things were different. Marta led her to a room on the lower floor, a space with light from real windows, with a soft bed that seemed impossibly large, with a basin of warm water and strips of cloth. The healer worked efficiently and kindly, checking the bones of her wrists and ankles, examining the chain marks, looking at her palms where the iron had burned her years ago. She made small sounds of concern, but no sounds of judgment. "You've been imprisoned," Marta said. It was not a question. "Yes," Isolde said. The word felt strange in her mouth, said aloud to another person rather than to the stone of the tower. 7 years. "You're remarkably strong," Marta said. "Most people would have broken long before 7 years had passed. They would not have had the will to keep themselves alive, to keep their minds intact. You did that." That is not weakness." Isolde felt tears on her cheeks, and she was not sure when she'd started crying. "There were other Omegas," she said. "They were taken out, one by one. I was the only one left." "You're not left anymore," Marta said. She was working salve into the burn scars on Isolde's palms, her touch gentle. "The Alpha King found you. That bond you feel, that is real. That is the mate bond, and it chooses. The fact that it chose you means something. It means you are exactly where you're supposed to be." Isolde was given a shift dress of soft linen, dyed a pale gray, and told she could rest. She was brought to a bedroom on the second floor, a space with real windows and real light, and a door that was heavy oak without any iron, and Theron showed it to her personally. "This is yours," he said. "What, you can lock the door from the inside if you want to feel safe. You can open it whenever you want. You can go anywhere in the fortress except the king's private quarters. The staff will bring you food if you ask. You can ask for anything, and if it is reasonable, you will receive it. If you do not want to do something, you do not have to do it. Do you understand?" Isolde nodded slowly. "I mean it," Theron said. His voice was gentle but absolute, the kind of voice that expected to be believed. "In this fortress, you have the right to choose. Your choice matters here." He left her then, closing the door behind him but not locking it, and Isolde stood in the middle of the room, in the space, in the vast openness of air and possibility, and she felt the weight of the tower beginning to lift. She did not sleep in the bed that night. The bed was too soft, too open, too much space that was not contained. She took blankets and arranged them in the corner, curling up the way she had curled up for 7 years, and even though her body had space to stretch, even though she could have lay fully out, she chose the corner because the corner felt safe. But she did sleep, deeply and without dreams, her body finally believing that it was not going to be woken by a door opening or a guard coming or the next day's forced meal. Days passed, then weeks. The seasons shifted. The spring that had been just beginning when Theron had ridden to the tower grew full and present. The gardens of the fortress came alive with growing things. The world was an endless source of sensory experience that Isolde had to learn to process in small doses. She would stand in the doorways of rooms, unable at first to cross the threshold. The open spaces made her dizzy. The number of people made her anxious. The simple fact of choices, what to eat, what to wear, where to go, would sometimes paralyze her because she had spent so long having no choices that the weight of deciding felt impossible. In the tower, every decision had been made for her. The food came at set times. The light came from a single window. The space was predetermined and unchanging. Here, at the fortress, there were infinite variables, infinite possibilities, and her mind, sharp as it had been honed in isolation, could not always process the vastness of it. One morning, about 2 weeks after arriving, she stood in front of a wardrobe of clothing, simple tunics and trousers, dresses of varying colors and fabrics. She could choose what to wear. The abundance of choice was suffocating. She stood there for nearly an hour, unable to reach out and select anything, frozen by the decision itself. Finally, Marta found her there and gently suggested the green tunic, and Isolde wore it gratefully, relieved to have the choice made for her, grateful for the guidance. But slowly, incrementally, she began to accustom herself to having agency. She would stand in doorways and force herself to step through. She would choose between 2 foods, starting small, bread or cakes, and gradually building up to larger decisions. She would request her own meals instead of waiting for them to be brought. She would open windows instead of standing beneath them looking out. The fortress smelled different from the tower. Where the tower had smelled of damp stone and waste and suffering, that particular scent of desperation that clings to places of imprisonment, the fortress smelled of stone and wood smoke and people, of cooking and leather and the living creatures that filled its spaces. At night, the scent of the gardens would drift through the open windows, the perfume of flowers, the green smell of growing plants, the dark richness of earth breathing out into the night air. Theron did not push her. He watched her from a distance, always available if she needed something, never demanding anything, never asking her to be anything other than what she was. A survivor learning to live. He left food outside her door, fine food from the fortress kitchens prepared with care. At first she could barely eat, her stomach shrinking from the treatment it had received. Marta advised her to eat small amounts frequently, and Isolde would pick at the offerings, discovering tastes that had been foreign to her. Honey, fresh fruit, cheese made from real milk, bread that was not hard as stone. She would touch the honey with her finger and taste it, and the sweetness would be almost overwhelming, almost too much for her palate to process. She would eat a piece of fruit and chew it slowly, reverently, understanding that this was not gruel, not hard bread, not survival food, but actual nourishment offered freely. The first time she ate too much, a bowl full of soup and 3 pieces of bread, her stomach rebelled and she vomited for hours. She was terrified that she had wasted the food, that she would be punished for her greed. But Marta simply brought her water to rinse her mouth and told her that her body would adjust, that the fullness of her stomach after so long of deprivation would take time to learn. The next day, new food appeared. No anger, no recrimination, just gentle guidance toward healing. Slowly, her body began to fill out. The acute points of her ribs began to soften. Her face began to lose the sharp edge of starvation. Color returned to her cheeks. The shadows under her eyes faded. Her hair, which had been dull and brittle, began to shine again with its natural silver-white luminescence. Marta taught her about caring for herself, about cleaning her wounds, about the small practices of hygiene that could be something other than survival. She taught her about the oils that could heal scarred skin, know about the herbs that could ease the nightmares that still came, about the simple act of bathing in warm water as something to be savored rather than endured. "You were trained well by someone," Marta said one day, watching Isolde move around the room. "Myself," Isolde said. She was still hoarse, still spoke in short sentences, but the words were coming more easily as she forced them to. "I had to keep my mind intact. I exercised. I sang. I talked to myself so that I would not forget how to speak." "You did more than survive," Marta said. "You thrived in your way. You fought against the suppression, against the isolation, against the despair. That is not something most Omegas would do. That is not something most people would do." Theron's kingdom was not small, and the fortress was not a quiet place. There were fighters training in the courtyard. There were servants moving about with tasks. There were people with concerns and problems and lives that did not involve Isolde at all. But there was no judgment. The king had brought home a rescued Omega, and the pack accepted it as his right and his business. After 3 weeks, Isolde began to leave her room during the day. She would sit in the gardens, on a bench in a far corner, and watch the world happen around her. The spring flowers were blooming, crocuses and snowdrops, and the first tender shoots of larger blooms just beginning to show their color. The grass was thick and green. The smell of the earth, the smell of life, was everywhere. One afternoon, sitting on her bench, she heard the sound of training in the courtyard beyond the garden wall. Shouts, the clash of swords, the thud of practice weapons against shields. She recognized the patterns, the routine exercises, the basic forms. She had drilled with her mother before her mother had died, learning the weapons forms that every girl in the packs was supposed to know, the basic skills of combat that might save her life. She stood up without planning to. She moved toward the sound without thinking about it. She found herself in the courtyard, watching through the archway as Theron and 3 fighters worked through a formation drill. He was magnificent in combat. His movements were precise and economical, wasting no energy, using his greater size and strength not through brute force but through perfected technique. He moved like someone who had spent his entire life learning the language of violence and had become fluent in it. So his scar caught the afternoon light, a line of history running down his face, telling the story of a battle survived. He was also kind to his fighters. He would call corrections, would adjust their form, would praise what they did right. The fighters responded to him with respect and not fear, moving with the confidence of people who trusted their king. As if sensing her presence, Theron looked up. His eyes found hers across the courtyard, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The mate bond thrummed between them, warm and present, but it did not demand. It simply existed, patient and real, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. Isolde turned and walked back to the gardens, but she returned the next day, and the day after that. She watched from her bench as Theron trained, as he taught, met as he moved through the space of his authority with a lightness that belied the power he held. One evening, as the sun was setting and the light was golden and long across the courtyard, Theron found her sitting in the garden. He moved carefully, as he always did, as if Isolde was something fragile, but she was not fragile. Isolde had spent 7 years building strength in a small space. Isolde had survived. He was beginning to understand that. "You watched today," he said. It was not a question. "I used to know combat forms," Isolde said. "My mother taught me, before she died, before I was brought to the tower." "Would you like to learn again?" Theron asked. "I can teach you, if you want to." Isolde looked at him. The Alpha King was offering to teach her, not to control her, not to show her that she was property of a stronger male. No, but simply to offer her the tool of knowledge if she wanted it. Yes, she said. So he taught her. In the early mornings, before the main training began, Theron would meet her in a quiet corner of the courtyard. He would show her the forms she had half remembered from childhood, would build on them with new techniques, would never touch her without asking, would never push her beyond what she was willing to give. He would demonstrate a move and then step back, letting her replicate it, correcting her stance with words rather than hands, asking permission before adjusting her position, treating her body as something that belonged to her rather than as an object to be shaped. She was good at it. The strength she had built through years of careful exercise translated into power. The discipline that had kept her sane in the tower, translated into focus. She began to move through the forms with confidence, with purpose, with the knowledge that her body belonged to her and could be a weapon if she chose to make it one. The tower had taken her freedom, but it had not taken her strength. If anything, it had refined it, honed it, made her understand the value of every bit of power she possessed. One morning, as she was running through a sequence that Theron had taught her, he stopped her. "Your second form needs adjustment," he said. "Watch." He moved through the sequence slowly, showing her where her elbow should angle differently, where her weight should shift sooner. The point is not to block, but to redirect. Let the attacker's force work against them. You have the leverage. You just need to use it correctly. She tried again, and this time she felt the shift, felt the way the form became more efficient, more deadly. She was learning to fight not just for survival, but with strategy, with knowledge, with the kind of training that would let her protect herself and others. Weeks became a month became 2. The spring deepened. The fortress garden became a place of abundance. Flowers bloomed and faded and bloomed again. The fruit trees set buds and began to grow, heavy with the promise of summer abundance. The world was alive in a way that Isolde had almost forgotten was possible, and for the first time since she was 16, she was alive in it. And still, Theron did not claim her. The mate bond was present between them constantly. She could feel it when he was near. She could feel his heartbeat echoing in her chest, could feel his emotions brushing against the edge of her consciousness, the way emotions did between mated pairs. But he never tried to formalize it. He never tried to seal the bond with a mark. He treated her like a person who had chosen him, not like a prize he had won. One night, she came to him in his study. The evening was cool, carrying the promise of the full spring that was nearly upon them. She had been learning to walk through the fortress at night, had been learning to navigate the darkness that had once terrified her, had been learning that darkness was just the absence of light and not a trap. She had walked these halls until she knew them by heart, until the fortress felt less like a foreign place and more like a shelter. Her feet were bare on the stone. She could feel the cool of the floor, could feel the texture of it, could feel the reality of being somewhere solid and real and permanent. His study had a door that was open, and she paused in the doorway, and he looked up from the parchments he was working on. The light from the oil lamps caught the planes of his face, caught the scar that marked him, caught the intelligence and patience that lived behind his eyes. When he looked at her, when his eyes, those eyes with the amber ring around the pupils, met hers, she saw something in him that made her understand why his pack followed him. It was not fear that drove them to loyalty. It was the knowledge that he would stand for them, would think of them, would spend his nights working on the problems of their territories and their lives. "I don't know how to do this," she said. The words had been coming easier, but they still sometimes got stuck on the way out. "I don't know how to be mated. I don't know how to trust that this is real. I don't know if I can give you what a mate is supposed to give." Theron set down his pen. He moved carefully, as he always did, giving her time to adjust to his proximity. "I do not need you to give me anything," he said. "The mate bond is not a transaction. It is not a trade of obligations. It is simply a recognition that our wolves have found each other and decided that together is better than apart. If you want to formalize that bond, that is your choice. If you do not want to, that is also your choice. I will respect either one." "But the alpha instinct," she said, "the desire to claim, won't that wear on you? Won't you eventually demand it?" "No," he said. No, it was said with such absolute certainty that she knew he believed it. "I have spent 31 years learning to control my instincts. To be an alpha means to rule yourself first, and only then to have the right to rule others. You gave me my mate. You called to me across mountains. You broke through iron to reach me. The least I can do is give you the courtesy of time and choice." She moved toward him. Not because he had asked her to, but because she wanted to. She had never wanted anything in the tower because wanting things had been pointless. But here, with Theron, with space and time and the possibility of a future, she was beginning to want things. She sat beside him at his desk. She took his hand. His palm was warm and calloused and strong, and it did not hurt her to touch it. "I want to," she said. It took courage to say it, and it took courage to want something so much. "I want to formalize the bond, but I need it to be somewhere open. I need it to be somewhere with sky and earth and witnesses. I need it to be a choice I make freely, and I need you to see me making that choice." Theron's eyes glowed gold for just a moment. Then he brought her hand to his chest, over his heart. "The bonding will happen when you are ready," he said. "We will choose the place together." But before that could happen, before Isolde could fully step into the life she was building, the past came back. Dragon Hollowfang arrived at the fortress gates with 24 fighters, all of them carrying the marks of his pack, scarred and hard and nothing like the controlled, professional fighters that Theron commanded. They carried weapons that looked less like tools of discipline and more like instruments of torture. The horses they rode were thin and nervous, and their coats were rough, suggesting a pack that did not care for its animals or its people with any particular attention. And Dragon himself was a nightmare made flesh, a man in his late 40s with a shaved head that showed the tattoo of a snarling wolf across his scalp, with cold pale eyes that never quite blinked enough, with a body that had been strong once but had gone slightly to fat with age and presumably the comfort of not having to fight for his position. His hands bore the scars of ritual combat, those deep gouges that came from the old ways of pack settlement. In his presence smelled like blood and old leather and something else, something that made Isolde's newly healed wolf want to hide. He came to the gates demanding that Isolde be returned to him, that she was stolen property, that Theron Stormbreak had violated territorial agreements by entering Hollowfang land and taking one of Dragon's omegas without permission. He stood in the courtyard, and his voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, accustomed to having his words treated as law. The insult was profound. No alpha anywhere would tolerate the suggestion that he needed permission to rescue a prisoner. But Dragon did not seem to understand insult as anything other than a form of power play, and he seemed to think his greater numbers would carry some weight. Theron received him in the great hall with Isolde's explicit permission. She insisted on being there. She insisted on standing at his side, not hidden away, not protected, but present. Dragon's eyes, when he saw her, flashed with something that might have been greed or might have been anger. She was thinner than she had been when she was locked in his tower, but she was also healthier. The color had returned to her face. Her eyes were bright. The threadbare rags had been replaced with a tunic and trousers of fine woven cloth, and the leather bracelet her mother had given her was still on her wrist, and she wore it like a crown. "She comes back with me," Dragon said. His voice was a rasp like metal on stone. "She is Hollowfang property. She was taken when she presented. She is mine." "She does not belong to you," Theron said. His voice was quiet and cold and absolute. "She belongs to herself. She is under my protection, and my patience with you has ended. You breach my territory, steal my property, and make pronouncements about my pack?" Dragon laughed, a horrible sound like boulders grinding. "You are not the only apex around here, boy. There is protocol. There are agreements." "The protocol," Isolde said, "is that omegas are protected, not imprisoned. The protocol is that presenting omegas are offered choices, not locked away. The protocol is that packs are led by alphas who uphold the law, not by tyrants who break it." Everyone in the hall turned to look at her. She had spoken for the first time in public. She had challenged a pack alpha directly. The air seemed to hold its breath. "You," Dragon said, and his voice was ugly with anger. "You are nothing but a resource, nothing but an omega to be stored until you were old enough to sell off. You had no status. You have no right to speak." "I have every right," Isolde said. She stepped forward, away from Theron's side, into the center of the hall. Her bare feet, the feet that had been imprisoned for 7 years and were now learning to walk in freedom, made no sound on the stone. Her violet eyes, bright with the clarity of someone who had looked into the darkness and found herself whole on the other side, fixed on Dragon with absolute clarity. "I will tell you what was in that tower, and I will tell everyone who will listen. I will tell them the names of the omegas who were taken from there and never seen again. I will tell them how long I was chained. I will tell them how many days I counted on the wall. 7 years I was imprisoned in that tower. 7 years of barely enough food, barely enough water, barely enough light to maintain my sanity. and I was not the only one. There were 6 others before me. Where are they now? What happened to them? She lifted her left ankle, showed the scarring that marked where the chain had been, scars that would never fully fade, that would remain as permanent record of her captivity. This is what your pack did. This is what you allowed to happen under your roof, in your territory, in the shadow of your authority, and you call it protocol. You were stored because you were worthless, Dragon said. Because no one wanted you. Because you were not beautiful enough, not strong enough, not Omega enough to be useful. Or maybe, Isolde said, I was left behind because I survived. Because even at 16, Suzy, I had the strength to endure. Because my wolf did not break. Because you were afraid of me. Dragon's face went red with rage. He started to move toward her, his massive frame accelerating like a boulder rolling downhill. Theron moved faster. He crossed the space between them like water, like smoke, like something that was more concept than person. His hand caught Dragon's arm and held it, and even though Dragon was wide and heavy and powerful in his own right, Theron simply turned him and drove him backward into the stone wall of the hall. The wall cracked. Dragon did not. Do not ever move toward her again, Theron said. His voice was still quiet, but it was made of knives now, edges sharp enough to draw blood. Do not ever touch her. Do not ever suggest that you have any claim on her or her body or her future. If you do, I will end you and every fighter you brought with you. Is that clear? Dragon's pale eyes were wide now, the eye that was on Theron's side of his head, bright with fear that he could not quite conceal. He had thought that size and aggression and numbers would carry the day. He had not understood that he was facing an alpha in his full power, an alpha who was also a king, an alpha who had spent his life training and honing and controlling his gift for violence. He had not understood that he was outmatched in every meaningful way. I'll have you censured, Dragon said, his voice shaky. I'll bring this before the Council of Alphas. You will do nothing, Theron said, because the Council of Alphas would see what I see, and they would be as disgusted by you as I am. You imprisoned an Omega. You violated the oldest laws of the packs. You ruled through fear and cruelty rather than strength and vision. The Council would strip your position from you. Your pack would be dissolved. Your territory would be divided among alphas who actually know how to lead. He let Dragon go, dropping him like garbage that had become uninteresting. Dragon stumbled backward, hitting the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. You have 1 hour, Theron said, to leave my fortress with what fighters you have left. You will return to Hollowfang territory. You will begin the process of dissolution. And if you ever show your face in my lands again, I will kill you myself. Do we have an understanding? Dragon, breathing hard, bleeding from his temple where he'd hit the stone, nodded. They left. The Hollowfang fighters, who had clearly understood from the first moment that their alpha had badly miscalculated, left with him. They rode out of the fortress gates, and as they went, a message was sent to the Council of Alphas, detailing the existence of the tower, the imprisonment of Omegas, the violations of pack law, the crimes of Dragon Hollowfang. The response from the council came 3 days later. Dragon Hollowfang was stripped of his title. The Hollowfang pack was dissolved. The territory was to be divided among neighboring alphas of good standing, and the Omegas in their care were to be catalogued and given choices of where they might go. When the news reached the fortress, Isolde was in the garden. She was sitting in the dirt, actual dirt, real earth beneath her fingers, and she was pressing her hands into it, feeling it, now alive in a way that she hadn't been alive in 7 years. The news came to her from Marta, who came to find her in that garden. It is finished, the healer said. Your suffering has been acknowledged. Your captor has been punished. Your people are being freed. Isolde felt something inside her break open, something that had been sealed shut since the moment she first heard the lock on her tower door close behind her. The breaking was not gentle. It was sharp and painful and necessary. She cried, not the quiet tears she sometimes shed at night, but deep, gasping sobs that seemed to come from the very foundation of her being. Marta sat beside her, not touching, just being present, bearing witness to the release. When the tears had passed, when Isolde had cried herself empty, she stood up. Her hands were covered in dirt. Her clothes were soiled. She looked down at herself, and she felt a strange sense of peace. She had earth on her. Earth was part of living. Earth was part of being real. I want to do it, she told Marta. I want to formalize the bond. I want to choose him openly, so there is no question of it. So the whole world knows that I am Theron's mate by my own choosing." Marta smiled. "Then we will prepare you," she said. "The king has been waiting. I think he will be very happy to hear this." The bonding took place in the fortress garden 7 days later, after Isolde had time to prepare, time to choose her clothes, time to make it real in her mind before her body enacted it in the world. The day was impossibly perfect. The spring had fully arrived. Every plant in the garden was blooming, flowers in shades of gold and pink and purple, the fruit trees heavy with delicate blooms, the grass thick and green and alive. The air smelled of new growth, of pollen, of the earth itself opening up to the promise of the growing season. The sun was bright and warm and golden, and the light came down through the flowers like honey, illuminating everything with a gentle radiance that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The entire fortress gathered to witness, fighters and servants and the household staff all standing at the edges of the garden, giving Theron and Isolde the center space. It was not a small thing to be bonded before so many people. It was a declaration of absolute intent, a public statement that could not be taken back. It was the opposite of the tower. It was the opposite of imprisonment. It was a choice made freely, witnessed by many. It was sealed with magic and with will. Isolde stood in the center of the garden, and Theron approached slowly, as he always did, as if giving her time to change her mind. She was dressed in a gown of deep plum velvet with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs, a gift Marta had acquired from the finest dressmaker in the northern capital. Her silver hair was loose down her back, falling like moonlight. She wore no other ornaments except the braided leather bracelet from her mother. When Theron reached her, he took her hands. His hands were warm and strong, and trembling slightly with the force of his feeling. "I choose you," Isolde said. Her voice was clear and strong, and it carried across the garden to every ear. "I choose you freely as my mate, as my partner, as the one who will walk beside me into whatever comes next. And I choose you, not because I'm bound to, but because I want to. Because my wolf knows your wolf, and together we are better than apart." "I choose you," Theron said, and his voice shook with the weight of it. "I choose you as my mate, as my queen, as the one who will stand beside me and help me lead this kingdom with wisdom and strength. I choose you not because I have claimed you, but because you claimed me first with your Howl. You are my mate, my Isolde, my chosen one." Then they were both shifting, their bodies changing in unison, and where a man and woman had stood, a black wolf and a white wolf now faced each other. Isolde's wolf, pure white with those impossible violet eyes, was beautiful in a way that took the breath away, powerful and graceful and perfectly, absolutely present. There was no hesitation in her, no fear, no doubt. And she was complete in her choice. She was whole. Theron's wolf was darker, his coat black as midnight, his eyes glowing gold with the bond igniting between them, the mate bond becoming real and visible as golden light that connected them, that wrapped around them, that sealed them into each other in a way that could never be unmade. His size was immense beside her, but there was no dominance in his bearing, no aggression in his stance. He was simply present, simply waiting, simply holding space for the mate who had claimed him. She marked him first, her teeth finding the junction of his neck and shoulder, the place where the mate mark would seal, her bite gentle but absolute. It was a claiming, a declaration of ownership and protection and devotion. And as her fangs broke his skin, as his blood mixed with her saliva, may the bond sealed between them with a snap of power that made the air itself seem to crystallize. He marked her in return, his bite careful, deliberate, perfect, placing his mark over her heart where everyone could see it, where everyone would know that she was his mate and he was hers. The golden light intensified until the entire garden was awash in it, until everyone watching had to shield their eyes from the radiance of two souls bonding, of two destinies intertwining, of a future that was suddenly possible when it had seemed impossible only months before. Then they were human again, and Isolde could barely believe the sensation that filled her now. She could feel Theron in her mind, could feel his emotions as if they were her own, could feel the wholeness of a bond fully sealed. She was no longer alone. She would never be alone again. "My mate," Theron said, and he kissed her, and the kiss tasted like spring and like promise and like the first real moment of safety she had ever known. The fortress erupted in cheers. The wolves howled, a song of celebration, of acknowledgement, of pack joy at seeing their king bonded to his chosen mate. The sound rolled across the mountains and somewhere far away, in places Isolde would eventually travel to and liberate. Other Omegas heard that sound and understood that change was coming. That survival was not the end of the story, that there were alphas in the world who would respect their strength, protect their autonomy, and choose them as partners rather than possessions. Isolde stood in the garden, surrounded by golden light and spring flowers and the warmth of her mate's arm around her, and she thought about the tower, and about the 7 years, about the isolation and the iron and the long count of days on the wall. She thought about the grid of shadow and silver light that had been her only view of the outside world. She thought about the scratch marks counting out time, about the corner where she had slept, about the bucket that had been her only companion, about the voice of her own wolf, finally breaking free after 7 years of suppression. That girl was still inside her, marked by survival, shaped by endurance. The scars on her ankle where the chain had been would never fully fade. The burn marks on her palms from the iron would remain as testimony, but she was not defined by those scars. She was defined by the strength that had carried her through them, by the will that had kept her mind intact, and by the refusal to break even when breaking seemed like the only rational choice. She was not alone anymore, and she would never let another Omega face what she had faced. She could feel it in her bond with Theron, could feel his commitment to the cause that was already forming in her mind. Together, they would change the packs. Together, they would build a kingdom where Omegas had choices, where survival was not the highest achievement, but the baseline, where love was freely given rather than demanded. She would use her voice, which she had fought so hard to keep, to speak for those who still could not speak. She would use her strength, which she had built in darkness, to fight for those still in darkness. The bonding was not an ending, it was a beginning. It was the threshold between the old life and the new one. And Isolde stood on that threshold with her mate beside her, with the whole of the pack watching, with the spring sun warm on her face, and she finally believed that she was free. The gates of the fortress stood open. The gardens grew wild and abundant. The world stretched out in every direction, full of possibility, full of hope. And Isolde Crimsonvale, who had been locked in a tower for 7 years, who had counted every day and survived every night, who had found her voice in her howl and her strength in her defiance, stepped forward into that world with her head held high and her violet eyes bright with purpose. She was not a rescued damsel. She was a survivor who had chosen her mate. She was a wolf who had broken through iron. She was an Omega who had become a queen, and her story was only beginning.